Atlantis is one of the greatest mythological mysteries of the ancient world, the legend of an island with an advanced, even divine people who were eventually destroyed by Zeus. While many people believe the story of Atlantis to be just a fable, there's evidence within the Greek mythology, and really the mythology of the world, that this peculiar myth is actually referencing a real shared history. The story of Atlantis is technically a Greek myth, but it wasn't one of the commonly held myths that were written down by writers like Hesiod or Homer in the 8th century before Christ. These writings were just transcriptions of the well-known poetry that existed all across ancient Greece. But the myth of Atlantis came much later from the Greek philosopher Plato. Plato had written many important works on philosophy and spirituality, and his writings of Atlantis were actually seen as his more controversial works, being dismissed as fables that he tried to pass off as lost history. With most mythology coming out of an oral tradition in ancient societies, Plato's tale of Atlantis seemed like a fabricated tale since there was no passed down record of it. Plato himself claimed that the only reason he knew of this story was that the history had been passed down to him from his ancestor, the Athenian statesman Solon. As an important figure in the Athenian government, Solon was said to travel to Egypt and engage in cultural exchange that led to the Egyptians giving the story of Atlantis to Solon. Greece, particularly Athens, saw themselves as a rather intellectual society compared to many of those around it. Egypt, however, was recognized as a much more ancient culture with a strong focus on intellect. And because of that, they were seen as having records of ancient history that a lot of the other cultures had simply forgotten. Citing Egypt as a source for this story was Plato's attempt to explain why the Greeks had lost this narrative, with the Egyptians having historical texts dating back to far before the establishment of Greece. The Egyptians were said to share this story with Solon because it was an important story of the Greek history in particular, because it was the Athenians who were actually the last force to stop the Atlanteans from conquering the free world. Interestingly, Egypt is one of the few cultures in the greater area that didn't seem to have a sort of universal flood myth. One of the key similarities the tale of Atlantis shares with the Bible, the Babylonian mythology, the Norse mythology, much of Asian mythology, and even mythology in the Americas across the seas. It is actually possible that Solon or Plato did have some sort of insight from lesser-known Egyptian history kept by the more secret orders, but citing Egypt as the source seems to be more so a call to authority, an attempt to explain more about what happened in the world before the flood in these different cultures without having an exact proof to cite. So what does the story of Atlantis actually say? Plato's account of Atlantis comes from two texts, Critias and Timaeus, with Critias not being finished before Plato's passing. In these accounts, Plato explains the creation of the universe in a rather complex system before eventually getting to the establishing of Atlantis. Atlantis is described here as a massive land in the Atlantic Ocean, which is given to Poseidon as his territory. This comes from an important part of Greek and really world myth, where reality is divided into three territories for the three powerful gods. This is Zeus, the god of thunder, who takes the sky and the land beneath it. Then there is Hades, who is given dominion of the underworld, and finally there is Poseidon, who is given rule over the sea. Here, it is explained that this isn't just power over the water itself, but like with Zeus, he is to rule over people groups who exist in this territory. The land under the sky that Zeus is supposed to rule represented primarily Greece and the greater European area, with Poseidon being given the island of Atlantis and the people that live there. Poseidon goes to Atlantis in the story and falls in love with a mortal princess there named Cleito, mating with her to create 5 sets of divine twins, making for a total of 10 kings to rule over Atlantis. Due to Poseidon's divine blood, the Atlanteans are first seen as a prosperous and noble people, leaders of the world from their island in the Atlantic. However, with each generation, the sons of Poseidon were said to marry more and more into the human lines and go from noble leaders to corrupt oppressors. Over time, their tyranny becomes so terrible that Zeus holds a council with the gods, seeking to wipe out the Atlanteans with great cataclysms, particularly a flood. This leads to the submersion of the entire island, which Plato claims to explain the shallow parts of the Atlantic Ocean, where boats were said to get stuck on Earth not too far below the water. A remnant of the Atlanteans were said to survive this flood and went on to try and attack Athens before planning to conquer the rest of the world. According to the Egyptians, however, it was the Athenians who managed to defeat the Atlanteans, stopping them from coming to Egypt and the rest of the world with violent force. This makes the Athenians heroes to the Egyptians, and in this tale, the Egyptians even claim that the Athenians are descended from the same mother goddess that they are, the same way that the Atlantean royalty came from Poseidon. Plato's story of Atlantis was mysterious even to many of his students, who struggled to understand how such a tale could be lost to the Greeks, even with the explanation of it coming from the Egyptians. But in reality, Plato was likely just trying to share more historical versions of the existing Greek myths. Atlantis is not mentioned in the original Greek myths, as we said, but in the original Greek legends, there was a tale of a great flood sent by Zeus, and a battle between him and other great gods descended from the ocean. The thing about mythology is that it is simply history told with metaphor. The metaphor in ancient times was used to make a story easy to preserve. As with a story of gods fighting instead of nations, you have clearer characters and simpler motives than the complex interactions of two nations or people groups. Metaphor also helps fill in the gaps of what information had been lost, especially after devastating cataclysms like great floods, where any existing writings in history would be quickly destroyed. The point here is that the story of the gods and their conflicts among each other are generally attempts to capture real history from the perspective of its people, and different myths are able to tell different versions of that same story. It's because of that Plato didn't really make up the myth of Atlantis, but rather he wrote it in an attempt to elaborate on the existing mythology of the Greeks after cross-comparing it with mythology that seems to exist in other cultures. The easiest way to show the connection between history and myth is with the story of the founding of Athens itself, which actually seems to hint at the same story as Plato's later Atlantis tale. The story of the founding of Athens dates back to another century before the works of Plato, sometime in the 5th century before Christ, at least in its written form. In this tale, Athens needs to decide which of the gods are going to be their patron deity, with the choices being either Poseidon or Athena. In order to decide which god to worship, the two would hold a contest seeing which could provide a better resource to the people. Poseidon was able to offer a water source, but since it came from the ocean, it was essentially unusable and certainly not drinkable. Athena, meanwhile, known for her intellect, gave the olive tree, which didn't just provide olives as food, but also wood, which was useful for creating housing and tools. Because of this, Athena was made the victor and became the patron goddess of Athens, which of course would end up being named after her. This more lighthearted contest parallels the story of Atlantis, founded by Poseidon, whose descendants eventually would go on to fight the people of Athens, with Athens being victorious. To many, this is an indication that the founding of Athens, as well as the myth of Atlantis, are both commentary on the same conflict or historical trend, as the story of Poseidon and Athena reflects the longer-term transition of Greece from Poseidon worship to mostly Zeus worship. You see, deep in the past, as far back as the 15th century before Christ, inscriptions exist showing Poseidon as being the dominant god in the Greek region, at that point being the home to the earlier Mycenaean culture. These people had built a culture around boating that had taken over much of the coast, but at the time, Poseidon wasn't seen as strictly a water god. This idea seemed to develop as other Proto-Indo-Europeans came in from deeper inland, bringing with them the worship of the sky god that would eventually become known as Zeus in the region. With Athens being further from the coast, it was somewhere in the middle of these two cultures that were slowly blending together, and the struggle between Poseidon and Athena, the daughter of Zeus, emphasizes that. Ultimately, the Athenians in particular saw themselves as descended from the influence of Zeus, but recognized Poseidon as an important part of their earlier history. Originally, the names of Poseidon and Zeus were both just used to refer to the chief god of the culture's pantheon, and when these two cultures would merge together, they would be seen as two brothers who both rule, just in different regions. With Poseidon's people being known for their maritime culture, he would become known as the god of the sea, and eventually relegated to a power just below Zeus. And of course, more echoes of this can be found even further back in the works of theogony from the 8th century before Christ. This text is the primary source we think of when talking about Greek mythology and the ancient myths about the earlier gods. Theogony means genealogy of the gods and doesn't just record the births and lifetimes of the gods, but also the conflicts among them and between their generations. Within that, the story of Atlantis could also be said to exist, with different metaphors used by the people of the time, and the Atlantis conflict just being one of the many conflicts going on, not just at different times, but also at the same time with all these different gods going to war. This is one of the most intense mythological accounts of history, involving a battle between the first gods, known as the Titans, and their father, the Sky, who they overthrow with much violence. Following this, these first gods, the Titans, are overthrown by their own children, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. It is from here that the three gods are given the territories we've described, including the ocean for Poseidon, but the story doesn't end here. In the Olympian generation of the gods, the conflict continues with Zeus fighting not against his brothers, but against another god known as Prometheus. Prometheus was not the brother of Zeus, but was more of a cousin. Zeus and his brothers were descended from the leader of the 12 Titans, known as Kronos. Prometheus, meanwhile, was the son of another Titan, the brother of Kronos, known as Iapetus. Now, Prometheus himself isn't just a god or a son of a Titan, but also the ancestor of the Greek peoples. When Zeus sends a flood to destroy humans, it is Prometheus who warns his son Deucalion to build a boat, similar to the story of Noah's Ark in our Bibles. Deucalion would go on to be the father of Helen, the common ancestor of the Hellenistic peoples. This makes sense in the Greek narratives, where Zeus is often a villain who wants to enslave the humans. Prometheus, meanwhile, is credited as their creator, making them for the other gods who needed humans to farm the food while they do their important spiritual work. Prometheus, however, favored these humans he created and wanted them to have better portions of food that they work so hard to cultivate. Because of this, Prometheus tricks Zeus into taking bones dressed up with fat and skin, leaving the meat for the humans to enjoy. This story is more ancient than that of the founding of Athens, which wasn't written until centuries later, and as such it uses different metaphors to describe the relationships between cultures, but it does still seem to be telling the same story as Atlantis, just on a greater scale. You see, Prometheus isn't just a descendant of Iapetus, but Iapetus took the daughters of another Titan as his wives. This Titan was known as Oceanus and was used to represent the great ocean that surrounded the entire world, which the Greeks saw as opening to them through the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic. The original 12 Titans represented different regions in the ancient world, giving a more detailed account of the many nations and conflicts that existed before the flood, among which Atlantis is just one nation with one conflict. Now, despite being the ancestor of the Greek peoples, there aren't actually any temples for worshipping Prometheus, and instead, his place in theogony seems to be some sort of fig leaf to carry over the story of Poseidon, or the general ocean god, explaining why Prometheus, or rather his descendants, are the one who survives the flood the same way the Atlanteans do with one remnant. While the later myths focus on the Greeks being represented by the children of Zeus, like Athena or Ares, they were written in a time far removed from the historical conflicts that shaped theogony, where Zeus was treated as a representation of the other parent culture that the Greeks had come from. The story of theogony as a whole is about the gods, or in this case the cultures, overthrowing their parents as they had become corrupt. In the time that the legends of theogony were being composed, Zeus's character was still seen as being less representative of Greek history and more the inland Proto-Indo-European that had brought Zeus worship in. What you have in all of these cases is the idea that people descended from Poseidon or some sort of water god are struggling against the god of thunder, Zeus, for control over Greece. However, the echoes of this conflict between a people of the sea and a people of the mainland didn't just exist in Greece, and seems to have parallels in myths around the world, even more ancient. Now, at the time that Plato was working on his writings for Atlantis, similar myths were actually beginning to surface over in Judea. In the Jewish Bible, there is already the story of the one great patriarch before the flood named Cain, something written about at least as far back as the 6th century before Christ. In his genealogy, Cain and his descendants are credited with most of the great contributions to human society. Cain himself founds the first ever city, teaches agriculture as his people travel, and his descendants are known for inventing musical arts and even metalsmithing. Like the Atlanteans, these great contributions didn't make up for the sins that Cain and his line were said to commit, involving the attacking of other smaller people groups. It's because of the sinfulness of this line in particular that the Old Testament God is said to send a flood to kill nearly all of the humans. These parallels in the Bible were already pretty close to the story of Atlantis, but at the time that Plato would begin writing Atlantis, the later Jewish texts like the Book of Enoch would also begin to emerge. In this text, instead of focusing on Cain and his sins before the flood, we get the story of fallen angels known as Watchers. These Watchers, like the Atlanteans, were of divine origin, but they ended up having children with mortal women, just like Poseidon did with Cleito, leading to a generation of giants who are said to become increasingly corrupt. It's because of these Watchers that the Book of Enoch attributes the Great Flood, mirroring the story of Atlantis from over 700 miles away. This is no surprise, however, as both the Jewish and Greek traditions seem to borrow heavily from the mythology of Babylon in regards to this flood and the pre-flood culture. The mythology of the Greeks, particularly its focus on Prometheus, has pretty direct parallels to Babylon and their parent culture, Sumeria. In this culture, there was one god who was chief of the pantheon like Zeus, known as Enlil. However, despite this god being the most powerful, the Babylonians saw another god as the most caring for humans, who is known as Enki. Enki is a clear parallel to Prometheus, with Enlil being Zeus, though in this mythology they are presented as brothers instead of cousins. This emphasizes the different perspective that these cultures had on the conflicts and how different people groups related, but they ultimately tell the same story of these groups and how they interacted. In the Sumerian and Babylonian mythology, Enki is like Prometheus, as we said, descending from the god of salt water and fresh water. In the Greek mythology, this is the Titan Oceanus, who first married their own sister, the Titan Tethys. Whereas Oceanus represented the salt waters, Tethys represented the fresh waters, and the union of these two represented the spread of maritime cultures into the mainland through rivers. In the Babylonian mythology, the battle between the Olympians led by Zeus and the Titans, which included these water gods, is told through the story of the younger gods Enlil and Enki fighting against their grandparents Apsu and Tiamat, the god of fresh water and salt water. Apsu and Tiamat become aggressive towards the younger gods, who they see as being too noisy. So they seek to destroy the younger gods, who work together to overthrow these ancestors. In both cases, what we have is the story of Atlantis, a culture that ruled from the sea, but which was also said to have already conquered much of the known world before their eventual destruction at the hands of the god Zeus. Comparing these mythologies likely helped Plato understand the meanings of his own culture's mythology on a deeper level, highlighting how a lot of different conflict seems to come from a culture that had seized power due to their boating expertise in the ancient world. The evidence for this extends beyond the Babylonian mythology, however, but also seems to exist in the Canaanite mythology, with the Canaanites being the people group that existed before Judea or Israel took over the land of the ancient Near East. The connections between Greek mythology and the Canaanite culture is actually very strong, with them having a one-to-one parallel for their key pantheon of the gods. This is something we've seen with Rome as well, where the father god Kronos is known as Saturn and is the father of 3 sons. In Rome, this is Jupiter, the thunder god, who is just a parallel to Zeus. His brother is Neptune, the god of the ocean, another clear parallel to Poseidon. Finally, there's a third brother, Pluto, the god of the underworld, the parallel to Hades. This exact structure is also found in the Canaanite region, where the father god is known as El and his most favored son is the thunder god known as Baal, a clear parallel to Zeus and Jupiter. Just like in the Greek and Roman pantheon, he also has 2 key brothers. One is Yam, the god of the ocean, a clear parallel to Neptune and Poseidon. He also has another brother known as Mot, the god of the underworld, a parallel to Pluto and Hades. This exact family tree is interesting because unlike the Greek mythologies, which show Zeus and Poseidon as always allied, the Canaanite myths actually show how the god of thunder had to defeat the god of the sea and the god of the underworld in order to become the chief among them. This would read to the Greeks as a sort of lost legend about Zeus, showcasing a struggle between him and his brothers. This is the story of the Baal cycle, which actually dates back at least 1,000 years before the writing of the Greek myths. In this story, to become the one true god, Baal first has to go and fight Yam, the ocean god. This was in a battle very similar to the one described for the Babylonian gods Enlil and Enki. In the Babylonian myth, they didn't just fight against the gods of salt water and fresh water, but also the monsters created by the goddess of salt water after she was mad that her husband was killed. In the Baal cycle, we get something very similar, with Baal having to defeat an evil sea serpent created to protect Yam, known in this text as Lotan and believed to be the inspiration for the demon Leviathan within the Bible. After defeating the god of the ocean, Baal would go on to fight against the god of the underworld, making him the supreme ruler of all existence. This myth would explain why the thunder god Zeus is the supreme god in Greece, but also a brutal god who doesn't love humans the way their own ancestor god Prometheus does. And when reading this myth, it would likely inspire Plato to focus more so on the conflict between Greece and the water gods, that the other cultures seem to focus on more so than the wide variety of titans that the Greeks had. Greece itself was a culture that was caught in the middle of these 2 different civilizations, and in the middle of the generational wars that led to them trying to preserve the sanctity of their god Poseidon, while moving towards the worship of the god Zeus. With the water god being villainized by other cultures like the Babylonians and the Canaanites, the Greeks would be making Poseidon a separate entity from the older ocean titans that the Greeks descended from, villainizing the parent culture and preserving Poseidon for continued worship under his name. To emphasize this idea, Poseidon is made the god of the Atlantic Ocean and its people in the writings of Plato. Meanwhile, Plato's son, the king of Atlantis, becomes Atlas. In theogony, Atlas is the brother of Prometheus, descended from the same ocean gods that he was. This shows how Plato saw Prometheus as a reworking of the Greek perspective from the people represented by Poseidon. In the story of Atlantis, Atlas meanwhile becomes the representation of the other descendants who worship Poseidon further to the west. So, with all of these different mythologies across thousands of miles and thousands of years corroborating the idea of the Atlantis myth, was it really an island that sank beneath the Atlantic Ocean? Now, when people talk about Atlantis being a real landmass, they generally point to the mid-Atlantic ridge, a huge scar running down the center of the ocean that looks like a collapsed continent. It's raised compared to the rest of the seafloor, making it shallow at parts, especially near the Azores. And even Plato notes that the area where Atlantis sank became muddy and hard to sail because of it. To a lot of people, this ridge is evidence of a long chain of islands that once existed in our ancient past, with genetic surveys indicating that there was some sort of mass migration that seemed to move eastward from this area into Europe, but also westward into the Americas. If an island really collapsed in the middle of the Atlantic, you'd expect survivors to end up on both sides of the ocean. In the Nordic mythologies, the era we live in is marked by a great flood, similar to the one also described in our holy Bibles. And in the Americas, the Mesoamericans have legends of gods like Quetzalcoatl coming to their land to restore civilization after great cataclysms such as a flood. The Atlantic Ridge itself actually loops around Africa to its other side, and some of the African cultures actually have myths of them coming from a strange land across the sea as well, but from the east of Africa instead of the west of it. It's because of this that esotericists like Madame Blavatsky from the 1800s indicate that even the Africans had some territory on the island of Atlantis. Now, to many people, the idea of Atlantis being an island that sunk in the middle of the ocean is just a fable to explain why this very real culture disappeared at some point. And because of that, the location of Atlantis is sometimes theorized to be in other locations. One of the most popular theories is that Atlantis was actually a place known as the Richat structure in Africa. This is an area of Africa that is so remote that we were only able to discover it after seeing the Earth from space. Visually, there is something of a similarity between the Richat structure and how Atlantis is actually described. Big circular landforms with ringed layers. But that seems to be where the similarities stop. The Richat structure is around 40 to 50 kilometers wide, with Plato saying that the central island of Atlantis was only 27 stades wide, which comes out to about just 5 kilometers across. This isn't just a huge difference in space, but there's also a big difference in the dating of this structure. This structure is believed to be over 100 million years old, and while it does have some ancient artifacts from humans, it doesn't contain the signs of a growing, thriving civilization. To me, when looking at the other mythologies, it seems beside the point whether or not there was actually an island in the Pacific where this civilization started. Just like with many ancient societies, they seem to have connections with people all over the known world, and perhaps even beyond what was known as the known world at that time. If you've made it this far into the video, you likely crave more information like this, connecting the different mythologies and religions around the world to reveal their true story. If so, consider signing up for our Patreon or YouTube memberships. There, you'll get 1 week early access to each video we make generally. But for this first month to get things started, we have 3 videos out in advance with 4 more lectures of early drafts for our next videos, so there's hours of content for learning. Check out this full list of subjects covered so far. If any of those interest you, go sign up, and of course, we'll see you guys next time.